Wow, this is great. My name is Phoebe Paget. I am Isaac's wife. Thank you. It's really great news for me. We just want to come out and say we're so glad that you're all here. I think most of you know that we moved to the small town of Philadelphia, and so we're very glad to be back in a real city. Sorry. Back where it started. Are you kidding? This is my family heckling me. So we're just very excited to be back here where it all started. And with that, I'd like to introduce my husband, the founder of Tangle, Isaac Saul.
Thank you. Hostile crowd to the Philly joke. I was not sure how that was going to go over. Thank you guys all so much for being here. This is awesome. I just want to echo what Phoebe just said. This is a dream come true for me to be here in New York City with a sold-out room at City Winery. So thank you guys all for coming here. Yes, give it up. Okay, I've got a few thank yous that I just have to go through. First of all, I do want to thank the venue, City Winery. Please tip your bartenders, hang out, order some food, order some drinks. They've been awesome to us. And I've come here as a guest before, so it's really cool to be on stage. Very grateful to be here. I also want to thank my team, who you guys will meet before we get out of here tonight. Magdalena is not with us. She has a newborn baby at home, so she's back in Oregon right now. But John Lull, who's on the cameras, Ari Weitzman, Will Kabak, also my dad, who's sitting up here, who's one of our trusty editors on the newsletter, Bailey. Sean Brady, our copy editor, is also not here, but is very, very important. He saves a lot of mistakes in the newsletter every day. And Russell, our intern, who's working the merch table. You might have saw him when you came in. Please hit that merch table up before you get out of here. It's very important. All those people make this possible, and I would not be here without them. I hate to do this, but I also have to thank my brother, Reuben. Tough to do. It's hard to say those words out loud. Reuben is the one who had the idea for doing a Tangle event. We had, when we were growing up, I would say, a relationship with a lot of animosity. He was the stereotypical big brother, and it's been awesome working with him. I don't know how else to say it. It's really special. Everything that's happening here is because of him, so if we screw something up and it goes wrong, it's his fault. But also, he was the one who encouraged this. He told me to do this. He's now the official Tangle tour manager, and it's really cool to have a kind of family affair thing. So thank you, Reuben. Yes. You met Phoebe. I have to thank her. She is out here, and we thought it'd be really cool to have her come out to start the show tonight. She's the most popular podcast guest we've ever had on Tangle. Every time she comes on the show, we get like hundreds of emails about it. And I figured it was time to let her get a moment up here. And also, like she said, just being in New York is so special for us. There's nothing I can say up here to, encapsulate what she's done to support me to make this possible. But thank you, Phoebe. I love you very much. In a similar vein, my mother's sitting up here too. What can you say about a great mom? I mean, there are no words. She also was one of the first people who encouraged me to just go out on my own and do my own thing 4 or 5 years ago when I couldn't find a job that I wanted. And she was in my corner and told me to take a risk, and I did it, and it was the best decision I ever made. So thank you very much, Mom. I appreciate it. There was going to be a special guest here tonight. I found out right before the show that he's actually not here, which sucks. He is Phoebe's brother. His name's Evan. And I wanted to shout him out because he's actually the person who came up with the name Tangle, which is very important. And early on, when I didn't know what I was going to name the newsletter and I was just starting, I took reader submissions. and he submitted Tangle, and I knew right when I saw it, I was like, that was it. And I texted him, I thanked him, I told him I was going to choose it, and we made like a handshake agreement that I would give him 1% of whatever the company became, which was a horrible decision. He brings it up like once a month now. So I was going to tell him to stand up and give him a little round of applause. Unfortunately, his babysitter got very sick tonight, so he's home with his kids. But I wanted to shout him out. I also wanted to just emphasize how important what he did was. I went back and looked at some of the other names that we had for Tangle. So I'm just going to read a couple. Back Pocket News, terrible name. The Shuffle, Unpacked, Amplify, Click and Know. I think Sean Keegan's here tonight. He suggested Deer Ears. All-time awful name idea. Anyway, Tangle happened because Evan submitted a really good name in part. So yes, I had to thank him. And then last but not least, and then I'm going to move on, I also want to thank our sponsor tonight, which is Summit Impact. They're out here. There's a bunch of them here. I am a fellow in Summit Impact. They have something called a Democracy Lab. It's a really cool program. Summit, and I'm sure they will appreciate this, is a very hard organization to explain. They do so much. They have a huge range of policy stuff that they work on, kinds of people they bring together. They throw these awesome events that I sort of have described as like TED Talk meets Burning Man. Like, if you want to party with a bunch of really, really smart people who talk about super intellectual stuff, go to their events. It's so interesting and fun. They helped make this event happen. They helped get these guests here, and I couldn't have done it without them. So thank you to the whole Summit team who's here tonight and for putting this on. All right. I want to talk a little bit about what's about to happen. Obviously, if you're here, you know the Tangle story, so I don't want to harp on it too much. But I do want to talk about why we're here, in my opinion, and what I'm hoping to do tonight. Aside from bringing together a room full of very open-minded people who I think are willing to, step outside of their comfort zone and hear ideas they might not agree with, we're also trying to model civil discourse. There are 3 guests backstage who I'm about to introduce and bring out tonight, and we're going to moderate a little discussion. They're all very, very smart people. They're very qualified people, and they disagree on a lot of stuff. And I just think that, just like sit with that, 3 smart people, experienced, have disagreements, should make all of us very curious and open-minded. And I want tonight to be a space where we can just talk about some of the things happening in our country and hear from some people who are probably going to offend you, probably going to make you want to clap, probably going to make you want to laugh. And all of that's good, and we should all kind of lean into that feeling. I think that's like the fundamental Tangle ethos. It's really important to me that we're doing this because I don't think it happens enough in our country right now. In fact, I would say it's happening less and less every day, and I'm really proud to be part of a team that's helping kind of change that a little bit. Thank you. Obviously, all of this happens in the context of the fact that in a few months we're going to have a very important election. Everybody says all the time, big, divisive, most important election ever, most divisive election ever. This is going to be a big, divisive election. I don't think there's there's no way around that. So my goal tonight is to talk a little bit about the 2024 presidential election, the 2 candidates that, for better or for worse, we have to choose from realistically. And maybe the 3rd candidate who might make things a little bit interesting. And we're going to talk about some of the issues related to the election. So the economy, immigration, abortion, some of the legal things that are happening right now down the street, which we'll talk about right off the top. So we're going to do that. And then right after we get done, we're going to chat for about 45 minutes. We're going to do an audience Q&A. So we're going to have a live mic going around the room, and we're going to take questions for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then in the kind of Tangle ethos, I will end the night with a good news story, just to keep the brand alive like we do in the newsletter every day. Sound good? Great. All right. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guests for the evening. First up is Catherine Rampell, who is a Washington Post columnist. She writes about economics, public policy, immigration, and all sorts of very interesting data-driven issues. Catherine, welcome to the stage. Next up is Michael Moynihan. Michael is one of the hosts of the Fifth Column podcast. He's a journalist, former national correspondent at Vice News, former editor at Reason Magazine. His podcast is one of my favorites. Michael Moynihan, welcome to the stage. And last but not least is Josh Hammer. Josh is a nationally syndicated columnist. He's the senior editor at Newsweek. He's an attorney, and he's the host of the Josh Hammer podcast, another person like our first two guests who I absolutely read every time he publishes something. Josh Hammer, welcome to the stage. All right, great. So I'm just going to jump right in and get started. When we came in today, we passed right down the road a courthouse where a former president is currently on trial this week. The first time that's ever happened in United States history that a president's sitting for a criminal trial. I want to start with Catherine. You've written in some of your Washington Post columns about this notion that prosecutors are kind of overzealously pursuing Trump and argued that they've been right to charge him in things like the real estate fraud case where he was overwhelmingly guilty, in your words. And when you look at kind of this kaleidoscope of cases that Trump is facing now, I'm curious to hear why you believe they're, I guess I'd say, broadly justified under the law and why you're supportive of some of the prosecutions that are happening.
Sure. To be clear, I know a lot of people have argued, and my guess is that one of our fellow panelists will disagree with me on this and may say this, that Trump is only being prosecuted because he was president or is running for president. I think if we had a more zealous white-collar crime law enforcement team, he probably would have been prosecuted for stuff like this 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I mean, maybe not the hush money payments because that was connected to an election, but a lot of the overstating of assets, for example, or understating of them, for that matter, when he was dealing with the tax assessors. So I think that the fact that he wasn't prosecuted to date really is more of a reflection of the fact that our white-collar justice system has been kind of asleep at the wheel for a long time. There were a lot of pretty obvious red flags. That aside, I think two of the key arguments that have been made about Trump, and in particular, the piece that you're referring to was about the bank fraud case, that he overstated the value of his assets in order to get more favorable loan terms as well as more favorable insurance terms. And the usual arguments that I hear about why that in particular should not have gone to trial, that was a civil case, are that A, it was a victimless crime, or excuse me, people say victimless crime. Technically, again, civil case, not criminal. Victimless transgression. And that B, it only empowers him politically. So let me go through each of those. On the victimless transgression, or whatever you want to call it, just because the banks didn't come out and ask for these charges to be filed does not mean that there were no victims. In fact, anybody who applied for a loan and reported their income, assets, and liabilities honestly, who played by the rules, was put at a disadvantage because people like Trump were instead shading the truth, shall we say, or more than shading, darkening the truth. And there is a finite amount of capital to go around. So the fact that Trump overstated the value of his assets meant that somebody else out there, some other potential entrepreneur or borrower, did not get a loan as a result. And think about all the more productive uses of the millions of dollars that went to Trump. What if they had gone to somebody else? What might have happened? And there were also huge risks that were taken by the insurance companies as a result of this. In fact, one of the things that he lied about was that he had said he was not under investigation for some set of crimes. I forget exactly what the details were, that when he was, in fact, under investigation, which raises the risk profile for that entity that was being insured. And so the insurance company, as soon as they found that out, jacked up his premium. So they clearly thought that they had had the wool pulled over their eyes. Beyond that, when we're talking about fraud, laws against fraud exist to protect the integrity of the marketplace, right? We need to have trust in counterparties in order to engage in transactions. I need to know that if I send money to someone in exchange for a good or service, that good or service will be delivered. I need to know that if I sign a contract, if I hold up my end of the bargain, the other side will as well, or else there may be legal repercussions. That's what rule of law is about. And that actually enhances the business environment, the fact that we have trust. That's why that we have trust. We enforce laws against fraud. That is why it is better to do business in the United States than in China, than in Russia, than in lots of other countries where they don't have rule of law. So again, just because you don't necessarily identify a specific victim who lost a discrete amount of money doesn't necessarily mean that it's good to let fraud go, laws for fraud to go unenforced, because you erode trust in the system. So that's point one.
Hold on one second. I actually
Yes.
want to stop you right there before you get into the politics of it. I'm curious to hear you respond to that a little bit, because I do think, based on some of the public comments I've seen you make, I think you disagree, and maybe not specifically about the civil fraud case, but I'd be interested to hear you answer that, because I think that is actually the best argument for prosecuting Trump, in my opinion.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me, to Isaac and to Tangle. It's really wonderful to be here, and look forward to a fruitful and productive, and who knows what may come of this conversation. Perhaps we'll even find some common ground up here. So, look, I talk about all these cases every single day on my second podcast, which is called America on Trial, which is a legal podcast with a special focus on the Trump lawfare. So, just kind of a shameless plug there for those of you who like what I have to say. I think the Tish James civil fraud case is interesting. It's also not what you referred to when you said you drove by the courthouse this morning. I mean, that's a very separate case. That would be the Alvin Bragg prosecution on so-called hush money payments. So I will very, very briefly address the civil fraud case and then just comment on the Alvin Bragg case. The Tish James case, it is worth pointing out, I think it's worth providing some context here. When Tish James ran for Attorney General of New York State back in 2018, she literally campaigned across the entire state, saying that she was going to get Donald Trump, and that when she got into office that she would use every resource at her disposal to do so. And sure enough, she has stepped in as a third-party intervener in a civil suit. This is not a prosecution, notwithstanding the fact that no other financial counterparty, and these are very sophisticated financial institutions. These are, top white shoe law firms, top white shoe investment banks like Deutsche Bank. Those are some of the actual counterparties that were actually involved here with lending with the Trump organization. Not only did none of them file a lawsuit, they actually oftentimes wanted to do more business with Donald Trump. So
if you look at the records, there are email records suggesting that some parts of the bank wanted to do more business, and some were very scared off by doing business with him.
The folks who were so
People
skittish,
who got bonuses were more interested in doing the business with him.
right? But the folks who were so skittish as to not want to do more business apparently did not make it very high up the food chain, because this thing never even got remotely close to the level of a lawsuit. More generally speaking, even if there is a black letter legal violation here, which there may or may not be, the much more important point for our purposes and your purposes as New Yorkers — I'm a Floridian, I don't live here anymore — but the much more relevant purpose for those of you who work on Wall Street and work in your fancy law firms and your investment banks and all of these fancy white shoe professions is that if this precedent holds, the potential ex-ante forward-looking incentive structure for entrepreneurship and investment and venture capital and all that in New York State are genuinely harrowing, which is why you have folks like Kevin O'Leary, so-called Mr. Wonderful from Shark Tank, who is doing all the media rounds, going around and saying that if this president stands, he will not invest a penny in New York State, and he would encourage absolutely everyone he talks to not invest a penny in New York State, because what that would mean at that point is that the attorney general could swoop in and use the power of the state to step in as a third-party intervener to try to bankrupt your company to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars because she happens to think that it is a merited lawsuit while the other counterparties do not think so.
Hold on one second. Can I ask you, when you say the precedent, you mean the idea that Tish James has wide latitude to bring lawsuits? Like what's the precedent you're talking about?
The precedent is because virtually every business is not necessarily going to keep the books exactly in the most...
This was not an error. No, this was not a simple error. You can look at the documents.
Deutsche Bank, when they give out loans, these are
reported
sophisticated
different things on different
counterparties.
documents. He claimed that the square footage of his apartment was like several multiples of what it actually was. These are not simple errors.
Okay, well,
I agree. People should not be prosecuted for making simple, innocent
It's not
errors.
a prosecution, it's a civil lawsuit.
Either way.
And the judge in this case, Arthur Angora, made many of his own sloppy errors as well, such as the well-known fact that he assessed Mar-a-Lago at roughly $18 million. But transitioning to your actual driving by the courthouse this morning and the criminal prosecution here of Alvin Bragg, there are more holes in this particular prosecution than your local block of Swiss cheese at the supermarket store. So where to even begin here? So we're dealing with fraudulent bookkeeping, which is a New York State misdemeanor. That's where the 34 counts of the Alvin Bragg indictment that dropped just over a year ago are. That crime has a 2-year statute of limitations, which told many years ago. Now, Alvin Bragg's attempts to get around that statute of limitations while simultaneously upping this thing from a misdemeanor to a felony is that he's going to claim that the fraudulent bookkeeping, a.k.a. the legal services provided to Michael Cohen when he paid off the porn star Stormy Daniels. I know it sounds really fun. It's like a Hollywood script. You can't make this stuff up. But the claim is that when the Trump organization recorded this $130,000 payment to Michael Cohen as legal services, it was improper because it was actually in furtherance of Donald Trump's 2016 election. And that has many of its own problems. The statute of limitations arguably doesn't apply even there. Alvin Bragg is also a local prosecutor. He has dubious jurisdiction, to put it mildly, to actually bring a federal lawsuit, which is what the alleged campaign finance activity is. All of that aside here, it is blatantly erroneous for one clear and obvious reason, which is the fact that in order to prove a campaign finance violation, as the Clinton nominee, the former Democratic FEC Federal Election Commissioner Brad Smith himself has said, in order to prove that a donation was made for the purposes of campaign finance, that has to be the sole and unequivocal and exclusive reason for the donation. It can't have gone to any other reason out there. And I have one very, very simple reason, which I actually explained to my podcast this morning, as to why this is obviously not true here. It's Donald Trump. I mean, if it was like Rick Santorum or Mike Huckabee or a Republican politician who presented himself as like a very pious Christian conservative, then maybe he might try to pay off someone if he had a personal foible in some bedroom somewhere to try to make the girl go away. Donald Trump's the dude who's been like on the cover of Playboy magazine. I mean, like this was part of the equation. This guy was in Iowa in 2016 talking about 2 Corinthians, not 2 Corinthians. The people who nominated Donald Trump knew exactly the kind of playboy, the guy who ran Miss Universe in Atlantic City, that they were getting. The notion that this was made in sole and exclusive furtherance to aid his election, the same guy that had the NBC News Billy Butch grab him by the you-know-what tape, it's utterly absurd and ludicrous.
So I guess it's interesting, and I want to bring you in here, Michael. I mean, I guess I kind of split the difference on the Alvin Bragg case a little bit. I mean, I think it's very obvious that they paid off Stormy Daniels. I feel very skeptical about the kind of novel legal strategies that are being used to, turn this into a felony. And I don't actually think they're going to get a conviction. Just zooming out a little bit, and this is a question for you, Michael. I'm curious. I mean, I think where the country's splitting right now is sort of a side that feels like there are these unjust prosecutions of Donald Trump and that everything we're seeing is motivated by politics, that they want to stop him from winning in 2024. And then there's this side that's like, here's this guy who's just a lifelong crook and everything's catching up to him finally. And I'm interested to hear how you sort of view that dichotomy and if you want to talk a little bit about, what they've discussed here.
Well, yeah, I mean, both of those things can be true, right? I wasn't aware that you were putting me next to a guy that has a podcast about this subject. He knows literally everything about the subject. It's just that he did a podcast today about it. Lord in heaven, and the economics. It's a tough person to be next to. I look at this in a couple of different ways.
Okay, Mike.
I'll be fine. A couple of different ways is I tend to look at these things from, I really regret something. We were talking backstage about Bill Maher's show. And in 15, I was on Bill Maher's show. And I said something I really regretted. I was, said, look at these people that are voting for Donald Trump. They're dopes. It was like my own deplorables moment. But the difference was that nobody gave a shit when I said it. Nobody paid attention. And I remind people, they're like, oh, you said that? No one cared. But I carried that with me because for 4 years after that, I was on the road. And I was doing this show for HBO, this Vice News Tonight for HBO, and I met 50,000 Donald Trump supporters. I went to about, dozens and dozens of Trump rallies. I went to my last one in Detroit recently. And you end up talking to people and realizing that when they turn around and boo you, by the way, in the press pen and fake news, and then they come and talk to you after and they're all really nice. It was a very jarring experience. But when you recently I talked to people about this in Detroit, and I heard something pretty interesting. I mean, these points are certainly interesting from a legal perspective and getting in the weeds and this stuff. But if you talk to the average Trump voter, there's a couple things that consistently come up. One is that on this one in particular that you were discussing, he paid it back. So what? He paid it back. And it wasn't the banks themselves that complained. Okay. Next step. Well, the integrity of the system, and the response is going to be, what fucking integrity of the financial system? Do you remember 2008? Do you see how these people rip us off? This is a populist kind of message. And then the overarching thing is, and this is the one that it really resonates with me. The first couple of years of the podcasts that I do, that you very generously introduced, was in the first years of Trump's administration. And a couple of listeners went back and said, man, you fairly credulous about the Russia stuff. And I said, oh, absolutely. Something smelled a bit wrong here. On the other side of this, Donald Trump says a hoax. I mean, we can parse the words there. But it was a lot of bullshit. Going back through it. And it was a journalist who used to work for the New York Times, Jeff, what's his name, wrote the thing for the Columbia Journalism Review, going over the coverage of it. And good Lord, how breathless it was. Go back and watch Rachel Maddow's stuff about we're going to have his tax returns. We're going to destroy him tomorrow. He is a Kremlin asset. What is the other side of that? Well, the other side of that is people stop trusting the things that you say about Donald Trump. And to Josh's point, they know he's a bullshitter. They know he's a liar. They expect this sort of thing. They've adjusted to it. They don't care that much. And look, he won. I mean, look, the interesting exit poll from South Carolina was the number of people that said if he was convicted of a felony, I wouldn't vote for him. Nikki Haley voters, that was about 60% that they wouldn't vote for him in general. But so it has some effect, of course, but there is just the volume of Donald Trump stuff. And you were hoping he would disappear just from a journalistic perspective, so you'd have to stop dealing with it. It was just endlessly boring to hear Donald Trump. And then you go to the rallies and you're like, oh, he's actually kind of funny. I'm sorry to say it, but he's funny on stage. And that's when you're trying to understand what makes this guy so popular. That's it. So when you get to these really specific things about financial crimes, people tend not to care, particularly when in that one they say, well, he paid off a porn star. That's what we're getting, as Josh was pointing out. He paid the banks back. Joe Biden had stuff in his garage too. Everybody has a pretty, not a strange justification for it, just a rather bland one. And when, Tish James is campaigning on this, Alvin Bragg is an elected Democrat. We know they don't like him. So yeah, it's not a hard sell for people to think that just the volume of this right before an election, as you pointed out, the first time it's ever happened, that there's something political about it. I think there's something political, and I think there's something justified about it, too. That's why I'm sitting in the middle seat.
Catherine, I want to follow up now about point number 2, because Michael just alluded to it there, is like how this stuff actually plays with the public. So you were going to kind of, I think, make the case that actually pursuing these prosecutions is not necessarily a political disaster. I'd like to hear that argument.
And actually, what I was going to say is a lot of the argument against the prosecutions has been it helps Trump. Like, I've heard a lot of people on the left say, why are they going after him for all these things? It just helps him. It feeds his persecution complex, which is what his voters really like, you know? And I say, I don't give a fuck. Like, if he did it, you know, to be honest, I don't really care about the hush money payment. I think the financial crimes thing is a really big deal, especially when it is that flagrant and undermines trust in the entire business environment. And in fact, I think the fact that Kevin O'Leary says that now he's not going to do business in New York because he's afraid somebody's going to go after him for fraud says a little bit more about him than about the legal environment in New York. I'm not aware of any potential crimes that he's committed. I'm not suggesting he did, but I would think, like, if you didn't, I'm not talking about honest mistakes. This was not a smoking gun in the case with Trump. It was a smoking arsenal. There is so much documented paperwork that shows the ways that he broke the law here, and I just don't understand how you can ignore that. On the point about maybe it'll backfire politically, that's not what the legal system is supposed to be about. And in fact, I agree that Tish James should not have campaigned on this. I think that was very detrimental to faith in the rule of law and probably harmful in this case. That doesn't mean that he did not actually violate the law. Those are two separate things. And I don't think that prosecutors should be making decisions about which cases to pursue based on what political ramifications they will have. That, in fact, is something that Donald Trump does or wants to do. He has said publicly, oh, I'm going to go after my enemies. He has said, like, oh, you better be careful if you're doing too well in the polls. When I'm in charge, I'll send the DOJ after you. I am not making this up. He has literally said this on TV. And there are people who worked for him in his term as president before who have said under oath that he directed them to have the IRS audit his perceived political enemies. Again, this is the kind of thing that an authoritarian does, considering using the arm of the state to go after political enemies. That is not something that we should want anyone to do on either side, whether it helps our politics or not. So the idea that prosecutors should go easy on someone or turn a blind eye because maybe it'll help them win an election, I just don't think that should be part of the calculus. And besides, like, everything makes Trump stronger. I don't understand. Oh, it helps him if he gets prosecuted or he gets charges filed against him. It helps him if he gets off. It helps him if he gets away with it. Whatever. Like, you can construct any narrative you want. And I don't think it should be part of the calculation. And I don't think we even actually know. We can't run a controlled experiment here to see, whether going after him for X, Y, and Z actually has any bearing on the polls.
Just real quick, I have to say, I think it's pretty funny, honestly, that we're talking here about being scared or wary of using the prosecutorial powers of the state to prosecute one's political opponents, when that is quite literally what the Joseph R. Biden Jr. Department of Justice is currently doing in Washington, D.C. and Florida via special counsel Jack Smith, who is not actually an independent counsel. I could get into the legal distinction if we really want to, but he actually reports directly to the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland. So this is quite literally the President of the United States prosecuting his political opponent. If that sounds totalitarian to you, that's because it is.
I'm glad you said that, because the segue that I was about to introduce was that I wanted to table some of the civil lawsuits and the fraud stuff and what's happening, with the hush money payments, and talk a little bit about the January 6th kind of stolen election prosecutions. And I'll show my cards here and say that, to me, that's pretty much the only thing I care about. I mean, I think the post-election actions from Trump were the most offensive to my sensibilities, whether it's, calling people in Georgia looking for votes or just, not turning the temperature down pre-January 6th. And I'm happy to start with you here, Josh. I mean, I suppose my question is, what are they supposed to do? Because I think there's, at least I remember January 7th, 2021 quite clearly. And before everything got put through the partisan ringer, there was a sense that felt broad and mostly partisan that A, this is the end of Trump's political career, and B, this is mostly his fault, and C, he could have done a lot of things to stop what just happened. And then over the next few months, what we mostly got were these stories and recordings and all these things popping up that felt incriminating to me as someone who was trying to watch, with an open mind and a balanced mind. And I found myself very much, caught up in this idea that this guy, some of these things that he did felt extremely threatening and dangerous to me, and like they could be grounds for prosecution. So I'd be curious to hear you kind of, I guess, make your top level case about why the Justice Department shouldn't be pursuing some of these charges.
So just because a certain action was icky or even monstrous or even amounted to flat out lying on national television does not make it illegal. In fact, it was the late great Justice Antonin Scalia who famously said that if your view of the Constitution perfectly mirrors your own idiosyncratic policy preferences, then you're probably not doing a very good or honest job of interpreting the Constitution. And I would say the exact same thing to the rule of law in general, which is that if you think that every bad thing is necessarily a criminal offense, then you're probably not looking at the rule of law with a particularly honest eye. Look, just to put my cards on the table here, I don't know, many of you probably are not very familiar with me. I live in Florida. I was an extraordinarily vocal proponent of Ron DeSantis' presidential election. I am not like a day one, Mar-a-Lago MAGA guy. So I assess these cases, each and every one, with a very independent lens. I happen to think that the Florida prosecution in my current state happens to be the most legally serious of all of them. Happy to get into that if we want to, the classified documents case, because Jack Smith's actual indictment, again, this is just an indictment, it's just his view of the case, but he alleges that there was an actual ignoring of a grand jury subpoena. You can't do that, to put it mildly. So there's some other stuff in there as well, but the post-2020 election stuff, look, a lot of Trump's personal conduct and a lot of the conduct of some people that I consider friends, honestly. I mean, like Jenna Ellis, a lot of the people who I consider literal friends were on TV saying absolutely insane stuff. I mean, this notion, like the infamous press conference where Rudy Giuliani had like the makeup like dripping down his forehead, like Hugo Chavez, like voting from the grave. I mean, look, I have friends, many friends who work at Fox News. We all saw the Dominion settlement. I mean, like, this stuff was nasty. Like, there were a lot of lies that were said during this extraordinarily tense period. It was the COVID. It was the Black Lives Matter. There was a lot going on out there. But again, not everything that is said rises to the level of a criminal offense. And with only very limited exceptions in this country, it is not illegal to lie. So sometimes it is legal to lie. So, for example, Congress passed a statute called the Stolen Valor Act, which basically says that you cannot claim that you are the recipient of a Purple Heart or some sort of other claims of military honor so as to not degrade the military. It reached the U.S. Supreme Court. They upheld the constitutionality of it, if I recall. So there were very limited exceptions where they actually do criminalize lying. But Trump was allowed to go around and say that he won the election that they stole. That is not a criminal offense. This is a
right. But hold on. But is he allowed to call a state election official and tell him to find votes in Georgia? I mean, is that allowed?
It's vile conduct. I mean, it's abhorrent conduct. But Fani Willis in Georgia. Fonnie Willis in Georgia is attempting to prosecute him on RICO.
I agree. I mean, look, I think I agree that the way the case has been built and constructed makes me skeptical that it's going to go well. And look, what Trump's doing right now, the delay tactics and challenging all the procedural stuff, it's working. I mean, I think there's pretty much zero chance we see a trial before the election. But I also think that I'm not worried about him tweeting so much. I'm worried about him orchestrating and pressuring actual election officials who have actual power to change actual votes. I mean, that to me is the thing that offends my sensibilities.
And what is the actual crime that he violated with that?
I don't know. You're the lawyer. You tell me. But it seems like that shouldn't be allowed, right? Like in a democracy, can a president just call up a state election official and say, like, I'm going to campaign against you and tank you if you don't go find me 10,000 votes? I mean, that seems problematic.
For conduct that is so blatantly unpresidential, that involves lying, that involves intimidation, harassment, things like this that we traditionally and properly look down upon, the remedies are: 1, the ballot box, which he had at that point already lost in November 2020; 2, impeachment, which they tried and they lost the second time; And 3, hypothetically, it would have been the Republican presidential primary this year. So the ballot box and the political process can continue to be a check. Again, not every actual instance of misconduct happens to have a black letter legal offense to
Mitch
it.
McConnell said he was not in favor of voting for impeachment, voting to convict on impeachment, because he thought it was a matter for the courts. So, like, how do you reconcile all of these things? Like, he can't be held accountable by Congress. He can't be held accountable by the courts. The only remedy for any kind of crime is you have to run for president and then get turned down by the voters?
I don't speak for Mitch McConnell, and that would be very humorous to Mitch McConnell to think that I do, because I've been very vocally critical of him many times over the years. But I think that the impeachment remedy would have been probably the proper remedy. I mean, if you think that his conduct breached the public trust, to use Alexander Hamilton's language in Federalist Number 65, which is the precise language he uses to describe the aegis of impeachment, then if he breached public trust, then he should try him for impeachment. That really was the time to do it.
I want to give you a chance to get in here, Michael, before we move on from some of the Trump trial stuff.
Is it showing the look on my face? Can you see what I'm thinking here? Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat either. And I think that I very much am on your side, that when that tape, the Brad Raffensperger thing in Georgia was, when I first saw the transcript of that, I mean, I saw that as a voter and I guess as a political observer and pundit in some way. And I was just appalled. I don't really care if it's illegal. It's enough to see that, find the votes, a particular number of votes. And I had friends that, because people in the political world are on all different sides of issues, they were trying to parse that statement. Get the fuck out of here. You're kidding me. You don't think, what somebody as like notoriously thuggish as Donald Trump is trying to say, find the votes. He's trying to steal the election, right? Whether that is legal to suggest that, because look, I get Josh's point too. I mean, there is a case here is that, I might make your life hard. Well, that's clearly illegal. If you don't do this, if you say find them and Brad Raffensperger says no, and then we all move on, is that illegal? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. What I do know is that as a voter, I could never pull the lever for that person. And I'm shocked that people can. And I'll tell you what, I don't have that deep internal, hatred of Donald Trump. I don't like the guy. I know exactly who he is. And I was mentioning that earlier today, I did a podcast in which we talked for 2 hours. Very odd. Talked for 2 hours about the PBS documentary about William F. Buckley that came out. I don't know if anyone's seen this. Came out 2 weeks ago.
Nobody's watching.
Nobody's watched it. Defund PBS. It was really funny to watch because William F. Buckley was part of my political education growing up because I'm a huge loser and I watched that in the McLaughlin group, right? I didn't really know William F. Buckley was a conservative. I just knew he was this patrician Connecticut guy who spoke in that way. But there's a part in the documentary, of course, that if you know William F. Buckley's history, in which he runs the John Birch Society out of the conservative movement, right? And Robert Welch, the founder, the Milk Duds Junior Mints, I think he was responsible for, millionaire that funded the John Birch Society, was a funder of National Review, his magazine. So he gave him money. And there was a point at which this was becoming a little too much for the conservative movement that was basically founded by William F. Buckley in their mid-50s. And said, let's get rid of these people. Let's run them out of the movement. Why do I bring this up? Because my hope is I have a lot of conservatives in my world that I love. And I want that moment for somebody to stop caring about elections and start running these people out of the movement because they're a disgrace to the party. They're a disgrace to themselves. And I just want that moment where we all say, that was a horrible mistake, wasn't it? And we go back to some sort of sensible conservatism. I'll give you an example of this. My friend Peter Meyer, the representative from Michigan, Republican, who voted to impeach. And guess who teamed up on him? You think it was just the MAGA people? No, it was the DNC too. They funded his MAGA candidate, his opponent in the primary, and that person won, and then that person lost in the general. Well played, DNC, but a little bit scummy, isn't it? We're in that world where, the internecine fighting of Republican politics has given us people that, Donald Trump made fun of Peter Meyer, the spelling of his name. It was the weirdest thing. He's on stage denouncing these people. Those fights within the party, and you see what's happening now with the Speaker of the House, is that we're in this moment of clout. Why do we know about Marjorie Taylor Greene? She's a halfwit. And I'm saying this as somebody who likes a lot of Republicans. I mean, her, AOC, these people stand out because they're on social media, they get clicks. And when I saw that Georgia thing, I hoped, and I was wrong, of course, that we were in a moment where we would get beyond the kind of Trump madness that has gripped the Republican Party and destroyed conservatism. I don't think there's anything conservative about MAGA. There's a few things here and there, but not much. And you'll see Donald Trump, the only thing he cares about is political survival. The man who said he was, he saved more babies' lives than abortion and the rest of it. And guess what? Did anyone see that all of a sudden he's moderated his position on this? Because Republicans are losing everywhere. Why do we trust these fucking people? They believe nothing. Peter Meyer, the representative, told me, lovely man, and I shouldn't be saying this, but whatever, we're only amongst friends and on video and audio. I am sorry, Peter. That the number of Republicans that came to him and said one thing publicly, he said it was like 95%. I mean, I was filming something, and the person I was filming with got a call from Mick Mulvaney. This was in 2016. And he was saying, don't you dare leave the Republican Party if Donald Trump wins the nomination. This guy is a psycho, but we can get beyond it. On speakerphone, we were filming this. What happened to Mick Mulvaney? In the documents case, I guess he was very important, right? But yeah, I think that when I see that stuff, I just weep for the party itself. I think it's in a really bad state. But at the same time, I can agree with Josh that I think the ways of Democrats, liberals, et cetera, trying to dislodge him have been both wrong, sometimes morally wrong, and largely ineffective. So
I want to just make a small pivot here a pretty large pivot, I guess, to some of the, I guess another crucial issue I think that we're going to be hearing a lot about in the next few months, which is the general vibe around the economy. And this is going to be something that I think a lot of people are centering in their political campaigns, whether it's, for the White House or down the ballot in the House and the Senate. And Catherine, this is, I think, something that's really in your strike zone. You write a lot about economics at the Washington Post. I'm curious to kind of hear how you would characterize the current state of the U.S. economy to just set the table for a discussion about it. Because I think one thing that I struggle with is just like explaining where we are, because it feels like everybody's feeling bad, but it looks like things might be good. And then you get an inflation report and you're like, oh, maybe I'm right to feel crappy about my rent or whatever. So I'd love to hear you just kind of characterize where we are right now.
Sure. You are not the only one who is confused about the economy. Everyone is confused about the economy. If anyone tells you they understand what is going on in the economy, they are lying or deluding themselves. On paper, on most metrics, the economy looks awesome. Really. We have had unemployment below 4% for over 2 years. The last time that happened, Nixon was in office. We have had really strong GDP growth. In fact, our GDP numbers and our jobs numbers are beating every other major country on earth. Not only that, they are doing better than had been predicted before the pandemic began. The IMF just came out with another report recently this week looking at where they thought economies were going to be in January 2020 as of now. So like the forecast they made in January 2020, right before the pandemic was officially declared, what would happen by 2024? The US, above those forecasts. Everywhere else in the world, understandably, way below them, due to a combination of scarring from the pandemic and, of course, a lot of other complications since then. The EU, for example, has borne the brunt of the war in Ukraine economically. So on paper, things look really good, with one exception. I'm sure you can guess what that is. That is inflation. And saying, well, the economy's good except for inflation is a little bit like saying, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the show? And look, the inflation numbers have gotten a lot better. They're still way above target. They're like in the 3% year over year. The Fed is aiming for 2%. But right now, Americans' wages are actually outrunning inflation, which is a good thing. That doesn't mean people feel great about it. And I don't think people are making it up when they say that they don't feel good about it. I feel like there are a lot of Democrats and progressives who say, oh, Americans are just like brainwashed by all this negative media, Fox News telling them that the economy sucks. Everything looks great. They're so rich. They have so many jobs. Like they're just imagining the fact that their finances aren't great or the economy isn't doing well. And I don't think that's quite right. I think inflation actually has been very painful. We have a lot of data to show that in industrialized countries, at the very least, presumably also in lower income countries, when you have a surprise shock of inflation, that is among the worst possible things for a political incumbent party. People really don't like it. They hate it much more than a recession, for example, because it feels very destabilizing, right? It is destabilizing. And the fact that people's wages are now outrunning inflation, I think is kind of cold comfort, because there's this sort of conventional wisdom in economics that people think that if they got a raise, they deserved it, they did it. If prices went up, it happened to them. In fact, part of the reason people have been getting wage increases is because of inflation, right? Like they're pressuring their employers to raise their pay so that they can keep up with the cost of living, et cetera. But people don't necessarily think about it that way. Like only nerdy economists think about it that way. So I think people are legitimately pissed off. And they've also seen a lot of price growth to date. And it happened so fast. Even if it's slowing down now, it happens so fast that they're like still having sticker shock whenever they go to the grocery store. They remember when milk was $1 or $2 less because it wasn't that long ago. Prices always go up over time. There's like that stereotype of the old man saying, I remember when coffee was a nickel or whatever. And it sounds silly. But like people actually do remember a year ago when stuff was a lot cheaper, when going out for dinner was, $25 a head at a, mid price point place rather than $50 a head or whatever it is. So I think people are legitimately pissed off about that stuff. And I think it is unhelpful for Democrats to just kind of tell people to feel better. The challenge, of course, is if you're Joe Biden, if you are the Democrats and you're trying to sell people on this economy, how do you do it in a way that doesn't feel tone deaf? And I think that is legitimately very challenging to say, like, look at all these great job gains, but we feel your pain. It's like it's so difficult to thread that needle. I think the good thing going for the economy, politically for Democrats, is that if you look at the consumer confidence numbers, they have been improving. They're still not where you would expect them to be today, given all of the other stuff I was just talking about, jobs and GDP and all that stuff, and even cooling inflation. Like I don't know if this is still the case, but when I looked a couple of months ago, people were as negative about the economy today as they were during the Great Recession following the financial crisis, which is just like wild to me because it is objectively better. Like whatever your complaints are today, like it is objectively better today than it was in 2009. And I think it'll just take a little while for consumers to catch up. And I think that's honestly part of the reason why Republicans have been pivoting away from messaging about the economy and more towards immigration, more towards other kinds of issues that are probably going to be much more salient by November.
Moynihan, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this a little bit. One of the things that kind of interests me about the politics of this is that, we've seen polling where someone gets elected, a new president comes into office, and the sentiment around the economy will literally flip in like a matter of 2 weeks. And I guess I'm curious, if you think this is an issue that Biden can run on strongly or not.
No. Not at all.
And why everybody feels so bad then?
I think that was a really great kind of summation of it. And the thing is that, it reminds me of when people were polled during the Obamacare debate, and it was like, is American healthcare a total disaster? And it was like, 70% of people say it's a total disaster. And then asked about their own doctor, they're like, oh, it's incredible. Mine, 99% people like, mine is perfect. And I think it's the thing that people miss about this is that they might be doing fine, but they presume that everybody else isn't. In one of those, indices is prices. And you have to really not pay attention. The problem And look, I was really mean about Donald Trump a second ago. I feel bad about it. I'm going to be nice about him now and say the one thing that was actually helpful of the inclusion in the discourse that had been taken out of the political discourse for so long was the idea of talking about elites and elitism and class and things like that. And so many people who are making these comments, whether they're progressives or whether they're just general economists or political people, live so far outside of the world where they see price increases. They just don't see it. I happen to be very cheap. I'm an amazingly cheap person, so I notice these things all the time. And I can't believe the price of things. Like, this is absolutely insane. And, I make my own money, so I don't, my wages keep up with however good or lazy I'm feeling that week. And so the other thing about it is that, maybe you have an adjustable rate mortgage. Anybody have one of these? I'm sure some people do. Or maybe you want to buy a new apartment or buy a new house and sell your old house. Guess who's not going to buy your house? A lot of people, because mortgages are 7% now. I mean, this stuff matters to people. That ricochet effect for people is very, very serious. The perception of things is everything in politics. So I always loved that Thomas Frank, who actually weirdly has been very good recently. I liked a lot of his stuff recently. But he wrote a book called What's the Matter with Kansas? Did anyone read this back in 2004? Which I always thought was the weirdest premise. And you read a couple pages in, it's like, why do these people not care about the issues that I care about? Like, they're all up in culture war issues. They should be progressives because they care about abortion. They shouldn't care about that. It's like, never tell people what they should or shouldn't care about. And I think that's the weird thing about perception and perception in politics is that we want people to care about certain things. We get mad when they don't care about them, and particularly when they don't see them in that way, because people live things. They don't live them through charts and graphs, and people are selective, right? I mean, they see one thing's gone up, maybe everything else has gone down, but the one thing that they see that they like has gone up, and that's going to affect them. I don't think this is a good issue for Democrats, even if the numbers are good. I mean, I think that they're flailing in a lot of ways because of things like immigration, and you see Trump's pivot on abortion and Biden's pivot on immigration, trying to go to where the center is. I mean, out of primary season, you're just trying to go where the nutcases are. And now you have to win a general election. And now everyone's diving towards the center a bit. I mean, not. But Trump, look, someone I heard the other day making the case that Trump is becoming a centrist candidate. And it's not totally wrong. I mean, people don't want to think that because they just dislike him so much. But there is a certain centrism. And there's a certain continuity, particularly on economic issues, with Trump and Biden. My biggest dislike of Trump's economic policy was his unbelievably idiotic reliance on tariffs and his love affair with tariffs. I did a film for HBO. I don't know why they let me do this. I pitched them. I said, can I do a full hour on the trade war? And they said yes. And I was like, are you fucking serious? And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, fine. They weren't paying attention. So we took as a premise Donald Trump's idea, like, we're going to make all the iPhones in America. We should make them here, right? And then this unbelievable boondoggle with Foxconn in Wisconsin, which was an unbelievable waste of taxpayer money. They never made anything. They said that then they changed to screens. And the premise of the piece was, you cannot make these in America. We don't have the material to make this stuff in America. And it was bad for the economy. Economists all point this out. I think you've written about this, that the tariffs were bad. And guess what? Joe Biden kept them right in place. So from one idiocy to another, we see them fighting. We see the left, right, and your friends fighting on social media. But there's often a lot of continuity between these policies and continuity between bad policies. I mean, we have inflation because everyone wanted to spend a ton of money. Everyone wanted to just print and spend during COVID. Now, there's a reason for it. It's not irrational in certain ways. But everybody, who's spending? Donald Trump's, yes. Joe Biden's, yes. I mean, it's a hard issue to run on.
The one thing I will say about the trade stuff is that I think politicians recognize that tariffs are bad and raise costs for consumers and kill jobs when they're the other guy's tariffs. But then once they're their tariffs, then they're great. And literally this happened this week with Joe Biden. So like 3 days ago, there was a White House spokesperson who was rightly criticizing Trump's plan to have a 10% global tariff, which is, as some of you may know, something that Trump has been...
which is completely insane.
It's completely insane.
It's one of the most insane things.
If you're trying
I think we disagree on a lot, but that one I think we agree on is completely nuts.
If you are trying to get prices down, why would you do something to make them go up? Like, it's legitimately confusing. Besides the fact that we're going to have counter tariffs and trade wars, because we saw this before, And that's going to potentially tank the U.S. economy and global economy, all that good stuff. The point is, a Biden official said, this is bad, this is inflationary. Guess what Biden did today? He announced new tariffs. He said that he was going to triple the tariffs on Chinese-made steel and aluminum, which, if it were successful, would raise the costs of goods that American manufacturers buy. There are about there's a much larger universe of companies that rely on steel as an input to make other stuff like cars or washing machines or whatever than there are people who actually make steel in the United States. It's a ratio of about 80-1, in fact. And we already have a gazillion tariffs on steel and aluminum from China. If it were successful, it would raise those costs. It would make American companies less competitive. The only upside is of this whole announcement is that we now import so little steel from China because of all those other tariffs that it's like probably not going to make any difference. Scott Lincecum, who's a trade guy at Cato, said it's like double secret probation. You know, it's like putting China on double secret probation. It's like they already have so many tariffs, it's not really going to do anything. But I am worried, if you look at the statement from the White House today, there was some hint that they were going to maybe consider tariffs on Mexican steel, which actually we do buy a lot of. So, you know, like a few days ago, Biden says tariffs bad. They raise prices. They contribute to inflation. Today, the exact opposite. And if you look actually at what, as Michael was just pointing out, if you look at what Biden said in 2019, 2020, he also was very critical of Trump's tariffs and then kept them in place.
Can I say something really quickly because I'm in the middle seat and I see the middle thing? Okay, the middle thing is this, is that in the 90s, we were very bullish on trade, myself included. There are downsides to trade. We did not foresee a lot of this and we were not prepared for it. It is tariffs are a tax on the middle class. They're a tax on the lower middle class. It raises prices on imports, obviously. But there was a hollowing out, and that is the MIT economist David Otter, who's written about this, and that is actually true. I think that the benefits outweigh the negatives, but it's not without consequence. I want to make sure to point that out because I'm in the middle. And can someone get me a Casamigos and soda, please? Thank you very much. It's done. It's been done for ages, and I'm thirsty.
Ironically, I probably find myself, I guess, the most pro-tariff, whether it's Trump or Biden up here. But I'll come back to that in just a little bit there. I actually don't really disagree with much of what Catherine had to say with kind of her macro level view of the economy in the 2024 election. So y'all might remember that last year, the Biden-Harris campaign tried to roll out their big Bidenomics campaign pitch. They actually did it during NFL opening weekend. It was a Thursday night game. It was like Detroit versus Kansas City, if memory serves. They had this big 30-second ad. The whole thing just went over like a lead balloon. And, you know, for those of us who are in the weeds on this stuff and we read all the morning newsletters, you know, Tangle included, obviously, and you see just how much the Biden people are struggling. They're palpably frustrated. You can basically hear them screaming, why don't the American people buy that this economy is so good? And a lot of it does have to do with the fact that there has been extraordinarily high inflation. So in the summer of 2022, inflation reached 9.1% annualized on the CPI index. That is the highest inflation in 40 years. I mean, that is no freaking joke. That is really, really high. And Catherine's correct that we now have positive real wage growth. Wage growth has finally surpassed inflation again because inflation has gone down from 9.1 to somewhere between 3 and 4%. But for most of the Biden presidency, wage growth was actually negative in real inflation adjusted terms. And people feel that. I mean, the price of eggs increased 33% year over year. Chicken was like 20% back in 2022. Gas, I mean, and the war on energy has been a massive, massive contributor to people feeling like the state of the economy is not very good. They are feeling that very much at the pump. Energy resources are 100% hurting people here. But just a quick word on the tariff debate here. Look, we're here in the heart of the Acela corridor. I don't expect this crowd to particularly relate to what I'm about to say. But for anyone who has actually spent some time in either proverbial or real America, you see...
That's how you make sure they're not going to be on your side. That's the exact recipe to make them not on your side. But go ahead. Yeah.
If you spend any time
you losers.
in the Midwest, in the American heartland, you have actually seen the tangible, very practical results of bipartisan neoliberal trade consensus, the so-called Washington consensus, the mentality that led that infamous economist in the George H.W. Bush White House back in 1990 to say, computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? It is this utter hubris to just let the chips, no pun intended, fall as they may on a global scale. Well, what has that resulted in? Well, it has resulted in, obviously, in no small part, our emboldening and our engorging of our number one geopolitical threat, the Chinese Communist Party.
American hero.
And
I
again,
love you so much.
For those of you who have spent any time in the Midwest, I have stayed in the same hotel in Toledo, Ohio, right on the river there multiple times. You cannot go to towns like Toledo, Ohio, Steubenville, Ohio, where I spoke at a conference a year and a half ago. You cannot go to these towns and not think about what trade policy and the complete hollowing out of America's manufacturing base has done to large swaths of America. And you know what? Learn to code is not going to cut it. Get up and move to another state, not going to cut it. A lot of people are firmly rooted in their communities. That's where their pappy, their grandpappy, they're buried in the local cemetery there. It's very easy for people in kind of a white-collar profession just get to pick up and leave. Heck, I've done it myself. But to kind of speak down to Americans and just say that, it's just simply not going to cut it. So do I support a 10% global tariff? No, that would not be my ideal policy. But we have this economic policy conceit that economic policy consists solely for the maximization of consumer welfare. Look, I majored in economics in college. I worked in economic consulting between college and law school. I went to the University of Chicago Law School in large part due to the fact that they developed the law and economics curriculum back in the 1960s. So I know a little bit here of what I preach. The idea that economics is solely and unambiguously dedicated to the maximization of consumer welfare and the minimization of prices is partially what got us into this mess in the first place. You obviously have plenty of competing demands.
The high inflation is due to too much emphasis on low prices? Like, I don't understand how you can argue both.
That. Well, I'm talking about trade.
Okay, we have 3.7% unemployment nationwide.
Okay, that's great. I mean...
Yeah. I don't understand. Are you saying that, like, America is massively suffering because we don't have enough manufacturing jobs? Because most Americans work in services.
I'm saying
I agree.
That America's resilience and national security on the world stage has been grossly impeded by bipartisan economic policy hubris when it comes to neoliberal trade policy, because we are radically reliant on foreign powers for some of the most national security sensitive goods in the world, such as the semiconductors that are conducted by Taiwan. Semiconductor manufacturing company to the tune of 35% global market share, which we rely on for our F-35s.
You can keep filibustering, but I'm someone who cares about data, and I can tell you that we make as much manufactured goods by value as we ever have. We make as much steel.
Apparently not due to the policies that you support.
We make as much steel today as we did in the 80s. We just make it with robots.
Do you support the buying of U.S. steel by the Japanese company?
Yes. I think that's fine. Would you rather that
Very
company
in touch
go out
with
of
the
business?
people.
Would you? Those people will still have jobs. They might go out of business and lose their jobs if they are not purchased.
Washington Post columnists selling out U.S. steel to foreign investors is literally why America's in the state it's in.
Well,
Japan,
hold on a second,
Japan is our
because
ally. Japan is our ally.
yeah, I think there's a difference. There's a difference between believing a policy because of the outcomes and believing a policy because of, where you publish your work or being out of touch with people.
I'm in favor of a much stronger welfare state. I think we should do more retraining. I agree that there are places that have been dramatically hurt by trade, and we have not properly compensated those who have lost out because of trade. I 100% agree with that. That does not mean we can turn back the clock to the 1980s through tariffs and hope that these jobs will come back, because again, it's not entirely about trade, it's largely about automation. Because we have moved up the value chain. We are no longer making T-shirts and other low-value items that have largely moved to South Asia. We are making much higher value items, largely through automation and through people who require much more education. Even the CHIPS Act, that's not really going to create that many jobs. The jobs that it is going to create are going to be for like engineers. It's not going to be for white-collar people who lost their jobs at the steel mills. I'm sorry to tell you. And besides, your comment before, I'm sorry, I can't let this go. The comment before about the war on energy is just such complete bullshit, because nobody seems to know this because it is inconvenient for both Republicans and Democrats to acknowledge this, but almost every form of energy in the United States, energy production, is at a record high right now. oil.
Certainly in no way due to Joe Biden's policies. He has put a firm ban on LNG exports. He obviously stopped the Keystone XL pipeline. He has shut down drilling in Anwar in northern Alaska.
Oil production is at a record high.
Due in no part to
Solar
his
production
policy.
is
Due
at
to
a
the fact,
record
due to
high.
the
Hold on
fact
a
that
second.
technology by the frackers is at an all-time high. It has nothing to do with his policies. It would be even higher were it not for
I just need to say something. Two things quickly. Everybody relax. I have towels if you want to towel up from that fight. It's like a boxing match. I just, by the way, denounced the people not denounced them. I said it was very nice of the people at HBO. Now I understand why they greenlit a documentary on trade. Where a bunch of people
People don't
drinking here
understand
at
it.
night and getting rowdy about trade. I was the one that was fucking wrong. This is an exciting topic. One small thing, and then obviously we want to get to something else, but one small thing is technology is a huge component of this. I mean, there were people that were opposed to the tractor, right? Because who sowed the field before? One person driving a tractor or 50 people? You lost 50 jobs and you had one guy in a tractor. Do you want to stop progress? Progress happens, and a lot of job loss is due to technological progress. As was pointed out, we have more manufacturing in America than we've ever had, but with a lot fewer people. And as it was pointed out, also on both sides of this, both pointed out, is that's a problem. We need to figure out what to do, job training, et cetera. But you can't, to quote William F. Buckley, because we're talking about it today, stand athwart history yelling stop. It is going to run right through you. And you can sit there and say, well, the technology, let's not use those things that will eliminate jobs because it will hollow out places in the middle of the country. There's a certain amount of that that's just going to happen on top of trade, which is a very important thing, but technology eliminates a lot of those jobs too.
I'm sensing you're a little outnumbered here on this issue, so I just want to give you the last word. I guess something you said raised a little curiosity for me. I mean, and we have to move on to some audience questions here in a minute, but maybe in 30 seconds or a minute, I'd like to hear your explanation for why energy production is where it is and why prices are coming down, all these things, if it isn't because of the policies of Joe Biden, because I think that's something he's going to run on, and I think it's something that he's going to make a centerpiece of his campaign to try and win over some more middle voters.
America became a net exporter of oil and gas under Donald Trump. It is no longer a net exporter.
It absolutely is.
No, it has actually gone up and down. At some point, that's where some point it's import.
2 years.
Okay.
Audience, Google EIA.gov. You can look at it.
If that were the case, then Joe Biden would not have been begging Mohammed bin Salman to open up more Saudi oil production 2 years ago. Obviously, bin Salman did not do that. Joe Biden looked like an idiot. He would not be talking about this whole debate as to whether to reimpose oil sanctions on Venezuela because he's scared about possibly affecting the flow of energy. So, look, again, my first job after law school, I worked in Houston, Texas as a private equity oil and gas lawyer. I was working in private equity-backed oil and gas transactions. And our clients were primarily drilling in shale fields out in West Texas, Oklahoma, a little bit of Wyoming, and other parts of the Rocky Mountain West. What's happened in shale and fracking over the past 15, 20 years, really since around 07, 08 or so, is incredible. Like remarkable technology. And again, the fact that it happens to be doing very high now says nothing about the fact that it would be even higher if federal lands were leasing more oil and gas drilling space. Joe Biden has cracked down on that. He has cracked down on LNG exports. He has canceled Keystone XL pipeline literally on the first day of his presidency, January 21st, 2021.
That would not be built by now.
And he has massively cracked down on Anwar in drilling in Alaska. So, yes, it would be higher were it not for his policies. To say that they happen to be high is not a reflection of his policies. It's a basic A yields B error. It's a logical error.
Go ahead, Catherine. I'll give you a little space.
Oh, my
here.
God. Sorry, I do need a drink now. Look, I disagree with Biden on a lot of his energy policies. And I agree that it is largely technology that has resulted in our producing record high oil production, including the record longest period of time in which we have been a net oil exporter. We were briefly one while Trump was president, then the pandemic hit and we weren't, and now we have been for a long stretch of time. Again, EIA.gov, that's the Energy Information Administration. That is all to say that, like, Biden did not turn off the oil spigot. a lot of these things would have happened regardless of policy. I agree with that. I just think it is fundamentally misleading / dishonest to say that the numbers are not what they are. They are high. And
gas prices reached $5.50 to $6
there was a
in
war.
California.
There was a war, right?
You think the gas has to do with Putin? First of all, this was in summer 2022, just a few months. How much gas do we get from Russia?
It's a global commodity market.
Understood. But if
it's a global commodity market.
Okay,
They're set by global prices.
I find this talking point just so humorous that the left tries to pretend like Putin's war in Ukraine was singularly responsible for the fact that gas prices pumped. Like there's absolutely nothing
I don't know
that
why
Joe
you're calling
Biden
me the
could
left. I'm just
possibly
stating
do.
facts. I'm just stating facts.
All right, we're veering into unproductive territory here, so a quick round of applause for our guests tonight. All right, at the risk of sending things totally off the deep end, we're now going to transition into audience questions. So I want to just say something really quickly about this before we jump into it. The first time we did a live event in Philadelphia, the Tangle team had a huge, days-long debate about how we were going to do this portion of the show. And I was very adamant that the ethos of Tangle would be to just send it and do it live. And there was some concern about that, I would say, and a lot of, suggestions about maybe we should do pre-submitted shows, have people write stuff down, and we can screen the questions and do all that stuff. I'm not doing that, so I'm trust-falling our audience here tonight. And I want to just set a couple of ground rules for your question. The first one is ask a question, please. Don't take the mic and give a monologue about your opinion. You can ask a question to anybody on the stage, myself included. I'm happy to answer anything. Obviously, our panelists, but just ask a question. Keep it as brief as you can. We only have, 15-ish minutes for this, so, no 5-minute setup for your question. Keep it to 30, 25 seconds. And just in the spirit of what you're doing, I would like to encourage you to ask your question in a way where you're not answering it while you ask it. Genuinely seek an answer to the information you're looking for. Don't sort of lead the question to get the answer that you want. I literally can't see anything, but I'm very confident that Ari, my managing editor, is walking around the audience right now with a microphone. So if you're interested in asking a question, you can just put your hand up, and Ari will come find you and hand you the mic. And
Hey guys, thank you all for doing this. So my question is for Josh. All right, so we can both agree that it's not illegal to tell a lie. The First Amendment guarantees that. But it doesn't protect speech that incite people to cause harm to others. Certain lies have consequences. If you look at federal law, it defines an insurrectionist as anyone who cites a rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States. So I'm wondering how you can defend someone's lie that prompted thousands of people to storm the capital of this country in an attempt to disrupt and stop the peaceful process of transferring power from one person to another, and how you can claim that action was protected under the First Amendment.
Okay, so I don't defend the underlying substantive conduct. I think that Donald Trump's actions, for the most part, in the aftermath of the 2020 election were somewhere between reckless and oftentimes even disgraceful. And in particular, I thought his decision to hold his big speech at the White House eclipse that day on January 6, 2021 was extraordinarily reckless. And I'm pretty sure I publicly said as much. I have to go back and look, but I thought that was a very, very bad decision. Having said that, the actual legal standard for incitement is it has to be imminent incitement to violence. There has to be a direct causation, a proximate cause, to use the legal term of art, between your statements and the action at issue. So this is actually kind of ironically what the university presidents, Claudine Gay, Liz McGill, and so forth, were getting at in their now infamous congressional testimony, where they infamously said that the permissibility of calls for genocide depends on the context. They were getting at this idea of, is it imminent incitement? That's the Brandenburg versus Ohio standard from the 1960s. It may or may not be right as a matter of First Amendment interpretation, but it happens to be the Supreme Court standard. It has to be imminent, direct, proximate causation. So I don't see it. I do not see that whatsoever. When it came to anything that Donald Trump said, he very clearly said, if you go back and read his remarks, again, he shouldn't have held the speech. A lot of it was reckless, but he very clearly said, go make yourselves heard peacefully. Okay? He literally said that. You guys can like shake your head all you want. You can literally go back and review the transcript. That is verbatim what he said. Now, should he have gotten on Twitter immediately after the riot got out of hand and said, stop, slow down? Yes, it took him too long. Again, he took many steps that were deeply imprudent and very unpresidential in those moments. But again, the fact that it was imprudent or unpresidential does not make it a First Amendment violation or anything like that.
I'm going to add something quick to this. Josh is right, and it's, the First Amendment standard is a very tough one, and it's absolutely covered in the First Amendment. There's no First Amendment lawyers that I've talked to who said otherwise. And keep in mind, there is a famous thing that everybody knows, but I think that there's an end to this story that most people don't know, is we all know the Supreme Court sentence fire in a crowded theater. Does anyone know what that refers to? What the case was? It's really amazing, because this is what happens when people weaponize the First Amendment. That case was a Yiddish language socialist newspaper in 1917 who was advising against, in this left-wing socialist newspaper from a Yiddish-speaking immigrant, that America should not enter World War I. He was right. And guess what? He was arrested for it and cited, and he was yelling fire in a crowded theater. That is where that comes from. It is a very, very bad thing to think of when you think of the First Amendment, because the protections are very strong, and that's what makes America, this is when I become very nationalistic, is so much better than so many places in Europe. I mean, you see in Scotland just having these horrible speech laws, Ireland about to go through an insane speech law. Nobody has the right of free speech in most of the places in Europe like we do here, and we should thank people for that. I don't like Holocaust deniers. I think they're unbelievable, knuckle-dragging pieces of shit, but I don't want to see them in jail. So the reason I bring that up in this context is that if you talk to any First Amendment lawyer, and most of the old school ones, by the way, are very, very lefty. Because guess what? In the part of the century when fire in a crowded theater happened, they were attacking the left. People on the left were being attacked by the government. Because the one thing that you'll always remember is the thing that you think is great to punish your enemies will come for you. And that's the reason that the First Amendment is as ironclad and as tough as it is. And it's a very, very difficult standard to say that somebody created the situations in that imminent way. And I don't think it qualifies here.
All right, Ari, where are you? Next question. He's walking around. I see him walking around. He's handing the mic to somebody.
So we're probably going to have two horrible candidates to vote for.
Probably. We do.
One of them who I think is a horrible president, and another one who did horrible things and doesn't deserve to be president. I live in New Jersey. What do I do? What's the right thing to have express my voice to say Biden shouldn't have run and Trump shouldn't have been nominated?
Can I just very quickly say something here? And the answer is not Robert F. Kennedy. I'm not a fan of his, but whatever. You know what is also a choice? Not voting. That is a choice. No, don't groan. Do not groan. What if I didn't vote in Massachusetts, where I'm from, if I didn't vote in New York, where I'm from, where we know the result, I am getting a lot of mileage out of saying fuck you to this process and to these two bad candidates. I don't have to vote for somebody that I don't like or I don't think deserves to be in that seat, and I don't think either of them do. If you're in a place, well, your vote matters. No, it does not. In certain places it does. And guess what? When I know it does, I vote. I wouldn't vote if last time it was 3 people. It was, 99%, and there's three people that I could have affected the vote. If you live in D.C., who's going to win in D.C.? It's like a Syrian election. It's like Saddam Hussein election, like 90% votes for the Democrat. It's no problem. It's no sort of moral quandary to not vote in D.C. Not voting is a choice. Giving the middle finger to the system is something that you are allowed to do. And you should not feel bad about it, because I don't want to choose from these two shitty candidates. And, if people are going to give you an argument, well, you have to vote. Why? Why? Why do I have to choose one of these people? Why don't if turnout is low, that makes a point to people. Like, political scientists pay attention to this stuff. And every election, by the way, is the most important election of everyone's lifetime. Every single election. I'm not saying it's not important, but I'm not going to vote this time.
I have a different answer than Michael.
Surprise.
Yeah.
I'm a bit radical on a few things. Can't be in the center all the time.
I think he's right. Something he said at the end there is right, that political scientists do pay attention to this stuff on a very micro level, which is why I think you should vote. And I think regardless of where you live, that your vote actually does matter, even if it doesn't change the outcome of the election. It sends a signal to the people who are watching what voters like you are doing. So, I can't see who you are from where I'm sitting, but if you're like a 30-year-old woman who lives in the suburbs of New Jersey, then there are political scientists who care very much about where you're leaning in this election. If you're the Democratic Party and you don't go vote for Joe Biden and you've cast a ballot for a third party, then, or you vote for Donald Trump, then that's a signal to them that they've lost voters like you. And so I think whether you change the outcome of the election or not is sort of, almost irrelevant. It's a signal that they're going to act on and respond to. And I think that's, like something powerful you should exercise. So definitely vote, please. Michael's fucking idiot. But
the best thing about it is he's paying for this drink, so I kind of have to agree with him. And I'm just going to keep ordering more and more. You're kind of right, but not really.
Yeah, but
if you vote for one of the two main major party candidates, it doesn't tell them anything. You don't get to vote as like I'm 70% in.
Candidate.
I'm 100%. You can write in candidates, but the third party candidates, it's very hard to get on the ballots. And unfortunately, I'm sort of more closely associated amongst people with the Libertarian Party, which is full of complete lunatics. So it's hard to vote for them too. I do think that is right, though, in the sense that mostly because he's paying for my drinks, I think that it's right that voting for a third party candidate is a viable fuck you too. Yeah.
And I'll just one last thing about that too is you might not live in New Jersey forever. Maybe you'll move to Pennsylvania one day. And the act of going
Look at the options. Amazing.
The act of going through the process of figuring out what candidate you want to vote for and participating in the game that we're all playing, whether we like it or not, I think is something that's going to be important, for the rest of your life. I take it very seriously. And, I agree there are different ways to give a middle finger to the system. In terms of what you should do, in your personal life about the fact that you hate these two candidates, I think you should just be vocal about it the way you're being here. I think it's an important thing to talk to about your friends, talk to about your family, why you feel that way. I mean, people make a difference in the way others view the world in really small and big ways all the time. And I don't mean to be all like magical about it, but I genuinely do believe that like you have friends who probably care about your opinion. And if they heard that you were like, I can't vote for either of these candidates, that makes a difference to them. And the network effect of that is probably bigger than you're imagining. So that's my advice. Don't listen to Moynihan.
Why are you so wrong about everything? It's incredible how wrong he is.
Looking over here.
All right, a question primarily for Isaac, but fair game for anyone who also travels a lot just through the work. Throughout your work with Tangle, what have been the greatest hopes that real America, Toledo, Ohio, and the gap, socially, between this Northeast corridor is closing in any kind of way in terms of ideology or how they think about the world? And what are some of the best tools we can have to start bridging some of those gaps, if you think it's possible?
Bridging, you're asking what are some of the best?
The divide between rural urban areas like Toledo, real America versus here.
Yeah, great question.
This, by the way, just for the record. You can't see it.
Look, I lived in New York City for 10 years, 8 years. I live in Philadelphia now. I have family. We spend a lot of time in upstate New York, kind of rural. I've spent a lot of time in West Texas, very, very rural. And my impression is that when you go and actually talk and meet people, and I know this is really corny, they're very much not that different. I think most people, politics are very, very personal. Data and the things that they see, news outlets like CNN or whatever reporting matter way less to them than the things that they experience in their day-to-day life. I mean, the crime is like the classic example that a lot of news organizations have sort of scared people into believing that crime is in a really horrible place right now, murder rates, whatever, and they've come down, they've gone up, they've come down, whatever. But that's like, in a lot of ways, it's kind of the unicorn one where the media has really changed people's opinions in my mind. I think most people react to the things that they see in their day-to-day life. So I don't necessarily know that there's a bridge to divide there in ideological sense. I think it's just we all experience the world very differently. When I'm living in New York City, the things that matter to me day to day are like the subway's on time and the bodega still has $3 egg and cheese sandwiches. And, those are the things that I care about. When you live in rural West Texas, it's like, is the river have water right now? Like, are we going to be able to get tourists this year to run them on our horse ranch or whatever? Those are the things that matter to those people. So I think the bridge is spending time in those places if you really want to, feel it for yourself. But I think it is almost entirely about the experiences that people are having personally.
Yeah, I think the coastal thing is wrong. I mean, it's rural versus urban, right? I mean, you go to Kansas City and it's votes for, Obama. It's not a surprise. It was a great city, by the way. All the cities in the Midwest, you get those places. It's just those are little blue hotspots and it's going to be right outside. But it's also the class thing. And I think this is something that Josh and I would agree on is that, he hired a woman who I'm interviewing tomorrow for the podcast, Batya Ungar Sargon, best name of all time. But she's kind of a Trump supporter. She's kind of, it's surprising, but she has very kind of lefty economics. But I love her just because she's pushed class into the conversation again, because I think the left has forgotten about it. I think the right always forgot about it. And that is always the thing, right? I mean, if you talk to people who are rich in Minneapolis, they're probably going to be pretty similar to people who are rich in Brooklyn. It's not going to be too different. There'll be some things that are different, but mostly it's a class thing. And, those urban centers and, being rural. I mean, the most enlightening thing I ever did is I shot a film in Starr County. Anyone know Starr County in Texas? Yeah, you can look at that. That's why he's on the stage. Starr County, Texas, the most Hispanic county in America.
95%, right?
No, I think it was like 98. There's like two guys that are like, what the fuck happened? They're just still there, and they can't speak Spanish. And I went there, and it was like, I'm not joking. It was the wildest shoot of my life because they voted 40%, like 40 points for Hillary Clinton, and they voted for Biden too, but like by 4 points. And you're like, what the hell, these Tejanos? And I was with these people and they had like MAGA hats on and we're all drinking beer and they're the funniest people in the world. They're all Mexican-American and they just had the concerns like anybody else. And I was like, oh, we are those dummies in America who, in New York, who say Latino. And they're like, yeah, that's fucking stupid. And I was like, why is it? They're like, what do you think, Cubans? Nicaraguans? You think I'm Mexican? Like, we look down on people from El Salvador. Like, why do you lump us all together? I was like, it's just easier and it makes us feel better about being white. But whatever, it's not a thing. But like, you go into these places and you realize that race doesn't matter. I mean, the indicators with Trump are really interesting. I mean, the last poll that I saw, this New York Times Siena poll, what was it, 45% of Hispanics, which again is totally meaningless, are supporting Donald Trump. I mean, the Mexicans, your rapists, whatever. We think we understand what's happening in the country. So whether it's urban or suburban or, rural and rich and poor, it is really important to get out and just talk to people. It's really important to just talk to people and like, wait, and not be a dick about it, but just like, wait, why do you think this? Like, didn't he say all these horrible things about Mexicans? And you get these really fascinating answers. And I'm not promoting the film that you can find on YouTube and see their answers at all. Because the company that I did it for is totally out of business, so it doesn't matter. Thank you, Vice. But yeah, it's really interesting to talk to people out in the middle of nowhere. For me, middle of nowhere.
All right, I think we've got time for one more. I can't see Ari.
No pressure at all. Last
the
question. Okay. I kind of had a question for all of you about the primary system of like Isaac. We've talked about this on email back and forth, kind of like you have the primary system and you have like extreme voters on both sides about the primaries, and then you get to a general election where you have to have a more appeal to the middle voter, right? So like, what would you guys say is the best method for changing the primary system, and how do we make it so that like the general middle of the ground voter has a real say in what the final election is, and like how do we thank you. I like you a lot. Like, how do we have a say in that? Like, because in the primaries, you're just kind of either side has their base voter that gets the say, and then you get to the general election, and the general voter doesn't really have a say. Like, what do you guys have to say about that? How do we change that?
I'll really quickly take a first stab at it, and then I'm quite curious to hear what the panelists might say about this. I mean, I've written about this in Tangle. I think that like an open primary system and probably ranked choice voting in a lot of scenarios would be really good reforms. And just to be clear, like I think there are a lot of questions about how exactly to execute that and what the best ways are, but you look at a state like Alaska that has done it, a state that's very, politically eclectic and all over the place, and they come out of it with a never Trump Republican senator and a Democratic House representative and like a MAGA governor. And those things like that to me is representative of a system that's working when you see that kind of mix that you might not see in other places. So I am very, very disheartened by the current primary system that we have. I think it's not working. And I feel like open primary systems and ranked choice voting are gaining momentum, and we've seen it work. And we've had some podcast guests who've come in and talk about that. But I would be interested, and we're a little tight on time, but maybe if you guys want to, I'm very curious to hear how you guys might react to that.
Yeah, to paraphrase Mark Twain, I think the rumors of the demise of the current primary process are greatly exaggerated. I actually don't have a massive issue with how it's currently done, to be honest with you. I think that the argument that the extremes are choosing the nominees is actually just not borne out by the data. So the first presidential election that I was able to vote in the primary and then the general was 2008. And literally every single time that there has been a competitive Republican presidential nomination, they have not chosen someone on the extremes. They have chosen a moderate candidate. So John McCain, 2008, Mitt Romney, 2012. People don't remember this. In 2016, Donald Trump's number one demographic subslice of the Republican electorate was moderate Republicans. People who actually, you remember back then in those campaign debates, Donald Trump was the one who was excoriating the neoconservative adventures overseas. He got a round of applause for it in the South Carolina debate. He was the one who was saying, oh, don't worry, we're not going to let you die on the street because you don't have health care. He took a lot of populist positions because the man is fundamentally a populist. And he actually captured really moderate voters, people who weren't necessarily kind of culture warriors. I personally was a supporter of Ted Cruz in that process, so I remember it very well. In 2020, obviously he was the incumbent, and then yet again this time you had people like my own preferred candidate Ron DeSantis who ran on policy to his right, and yet again he couldn't even hold the torch to Donald Trump. So I'm just not sure that this is accurate. Even on the Democratic side of the aisle in 2020. There were so many candidates who were running far to the left of Joe Biden in 2020, and obviously, I think Biden finished fifth in New Hampshire before his. I think it was like Jim Clyburn got behind him in South Carolina, and then you had Liz Warren and other people start to drop out. But there were so many options way to the left of Joe Biden. So I'm just not sure that this narrative is correct, that the extremes are choosing the nominees, at least in my adult lifetime, frankly.
Just quickly, I would say I think, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the way I heard that question was really about Congress, not necessarily the White House. So, I agree that maybe a general election or, a big Republican primary, a big Democratic primary, we get more moderate candidates out of that. I don't know, Michael or Catherine, do you guys have thoughts on that you want to share?
Yeah, I generally agree with you, Isaac, on open primary with ranked choice voting. And maybe I feel this more personally because in New York, not only does my presidential vote not count, but basically none of my other votes count either because I'm not registered with a party. And that means I cannot vote in a primary. So by the time we get to the general election, the choices are already made. And I find that very frustrating. And that's not the case in every state, that you can in Alaska among them. You don't have to be a member of a party to have a choice in the primary. The other thing I would say is that part of the reason why you might have some more extreme candidates getting elected in the primary, whether we're talking about in Congress or other down ballot races, also has to do with turnout. So if only the diehard crazy people show up for the primary, whether it's an open primary or not, their voices are going to be louder, right? That their votes are going to matter more. So if you're in a state where you do have a choice to vote in a primary, and primary turnout is generally very low, much lower than that for the general turnout.
Can I end on a very positive note?
Yes, please.
Can I agree with everyone? Be like this unbelievable, boring hippie, kumbaya, because everyone's right about this. A couple things. I mean, Josh, I think, is right. I mean, one of the things that you see about this, I think it is also true that in, congressional races, et cetera, you see a lot of batty people get through primaries, but guess what? Republicans suffered dearly for this. I mean, all of Donald Trump's preferred candidates got fucking creamed. And, it's like you have to, Republicans will try to figure out how to get around that in the future. But I think Josh's point is also right, is that there was a thing that we tried to obscure on the presidential level, Donald Trump's appeal. And as journalists, we didn't kind of, I think, properly engage with this idea. And it's like, yeah, primaries, they favor extremists. And it's like, no, people really had gone towards the kind of populist conservatism and kind of MAGA. And it makes people feel a little better if they say, well, if that primary system was different, we wouldn't get him. It's like, well, 65 million people voted for this person, and we have to confront why that is. And I'm not saying that as if it's, I'm totally neutral in this, in the sense that like it's some clear and present danger. I'm just saying that as journalists, just from my perspective, good Lord, did we ignore this? Did we? And I started by saying that Bill Maher appearance where I was like being an idiot. And then I spent a number of years trying to figure this stuff out and trying to talk to people. And it was only for my personal edification. But I really kind of was like, oh yeah, what Josh is saying, but it was right. I mean, there are people, the John McCains of the world were gone. He was rapturously greeted by denouncing the Iraq War, that Republicans for a certain period of time, even after the disaster of the Iraq War, wouldn't say. It was considered kind of gauche to say that George W. Bush screwed this up. But in the end, everybody's right here. Yeah, because I think that there's a problem with the primary system, but I think there's a way that it tries to obscure the fact, like maybe we're safe and these Trump people aren't real because the primary system screwed up. No, I think the primary system is screwed up, and I think Trump is very real. So, and that is very influential.
All right. On that note, we're going to let these guys go. Big round of applause for our guests tonight. Thank you guys very much. All right, thank you guys so much. Okay, I have to be relatively quick here. Fun fact, Michael Che is coming to do a stand-up set here in a few minutes. So I'm not kidding. We're Michael Che's opener tonight. No, you do not get to stay. You can't stay here. Okay, listen, I promised a good news story before we got out of here. And I thought Moynihan's feel-good thing was not as good as this, so I'm going to share it really quickly. A few months ago, I was looking through my phone for something, like looking through my notes app, and I stumbled across this old budget that I had when I was living here in New York City and was working as a journalist. And I made a note of it because I decided that I wanted to share it. And the budget was basically just like, how was I going to pay rent and live in New York as a reporter? And so I had 4 items on the budget. And the first one was to keep the job that I had as a full-time editor. And the second one was to freelance 4 articles for this little conservative magazine called the Independent Journal Review. And then the third one was to freelance 1 article a month for Vox, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And then the fourth one was to get 100 paying subscribers for this newsletter Tangle that I was starting, which was gonna, come out to $400 a month, which would make a big difference. And that was how I was going to put some money away. That was almost exactly 4 years ago that the note was from. It's just like we're a little past the 4-year point. I just want to take stock of that really quick. We have 100,000 subscribers on our mailing list, 15,000 paid. Just in this room, there are 200 people right now, and I do not take that for granted. I'm incredibly grateful. I count my lucky stars every day. The people who just went backstage know this, and I'm sure many of you know this. The media industry is in decline. Please pay for your news, support local journalism, support reporters who do work that you value. It's incredibly, incredibly hard out there right now for us. And I'm so, so lucky. Part of what happened because of Tangle's success was that I got to not be alone anymore. I got to build a team, which was the best thing ever. Being in the trenches by yourself sucks. I missed the newsroom. I missed the back and forth. I missed the arguing. I missed the debating. I missed having people in the room with me. And because of all of you, because of the people who have supported us and supported our work and paid for what we're doing, I got to hire people, and I want to acknowledge them tonight quickly because Michael Che is coming. But I'd like to just really briefly invite John and Will and Ari up on stage really quick. Come. I had a lot planned that I want to say about them, but we went a little over time. I also want to acknowledge that we're not just like 4 white dudes who do this, for 3 white dudes and John who do this. We have Magdalena also, who's not here. I miss her dearly. She was my first hire. And she's so important to the team, and I'm so sad that she's not here tonight. But she's being a mom. She's doing the right thing. And I just want to say about these guys that like what I do every day is not possible without them. Will researches everything that you see in the newsletter. He does like a first blush on stuff before it gets to me. John edits our podcast and our YouTube channel. Every single day he does the podcast. He puts out, 1 or 2 YouTube videos a month. There are companies that have 6 people who do what John does by himself. It's literally insane. And Ari is, on top of being an old friend, also the best editor I've ever had in my life. And I mean that very sincerely. And I've worked for a lot of editors, and he didn't even get professionally trained doing it. He's just an awesome writer. And nothing that comes out in Tangle comes out without his touch on it. So thank you, Ari. Thank you guys all so much for being here. If you have a VIP ticket, those of you guys in the front, we're going to do our meet and greet across the hall in a few minutes right after the show. There's a little dining room over there. Please tip your bartenders. Please come back when we do this next time. Thank you guys so much.